Okay. So, how is that? We have actually, let's do this. So we have time to do some questions, and I'd love to hear anybody, if anybody has any observations or interesting, I don't know, stories that that they heard or want to communicate, or if you have questions on the talk itself, and we have the mic.
Mic is
Did anybody, I mean, so how many people, by raising your hands, how many people described a technique that they learned from a meditation or a Buddhist thing? And okay. And everybody else is kind of, is sort of half and half. And then other people, how many people is like a life skill that they developed from parents or college or something? Yeah.
I actually talked a little bit about my technique. I wouldn't necessarily call this strictly Buddhist, but I just was learning from someone who's not even Buddhist, and she had a very Buddhist approach to something, and where I was being very stubborn, and I'm like, this person is an organizational nightmare. How can I work with them? And my friend, was just like, maybe we've gotten used to the way we do things. Maybe we need to give an olive branch to this person and ask her to explain her system. And so I think sometimes, talking over things with people that you trust, sometimes they can give you insight when you're caught up in your story. So that's a little bit of what I shared.
And I think that's really right. That's a very common thing that happens to us, right? We say somebody we find difficult to deal with. You start to label that person as, oh, here comes that person that's difficult to deal with, and so suddenly your interaction doesn't become. You're not interacting with the person in front of you. You're interacting with some like caricature of the person that you have drawn in your mind, right? And that tends to preclude wanting to say, oh, well, let me try and understand this person a little bit better. Maybe they have some reasoning in terms of the way they do things, some rhyme to their, reason to their rhyme, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah.
I just want to say that was really lovely to actually connect with someone, because there's something about talking about Dharma with people and feeling that connection that brings it to a whole different level. Mm-hmm. So thanks for allowing for that. And it kind of came up in our interaction, but
battery might be down.
Yeah, it's dying. Whole topic of metaphor. Speak loudly.
Okay.
Okay. So I liked your metaphors with the yanas, with the cars and all that. One that also I heard was one of oxygen mask with the Hinayana and the Mahayana. The idea of Hinayana, working with your own mind, your own sense of self, is kind of like putting the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can bring it out to other people in the Mahayana. So, but I was even thinking even broader beyond the yanas as like skillful means working with the path. How addiction actually, for some people, is a sort of yana, even if it's not a skillful one. It's a way of dealing with reality, with suffering, and with the challenges of life. I mean, would you agree with that, or you think there's some?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think that, without judging there was a social worker I used to work with who taught at college, Marymount Manhattan College, where I used to work, and I asked her a question one day, and it was about an ex, or I don't know if she was a girlfriend at the time. I think it was an ex-girlfriend, but I was like, so you've worked with a lot of people who struggle with a lot of things. My ex or my girlfriend, she smokes pot every day, and she uses it as a way to cope, but maybe also a way to not deal with things. And what this, I think, very wise, woman said, she's like, we all have coping strategies and methods of coping. And the way I look at it is, how is that coping mechanism effective, and does it help them through their lives, or does it make their lives harder for them? Is it destructive? Does it actually cause more problems than it helps? And I thought that was a very pragmatic and wise way of looking at that, at smoking pot all the time. And I think that that's true of, I think that's true of all kinds of drugs. I think it's true of alcohol. I think that alcohol obviously is like a big one for abuse, but it's also one that, if you have like a drink, if you don't have an issue and you have like a drink or two at night, and it relaxes you and helps you kind of like deal with the day, is that necessarily a bad thing? I think not, not really. I mean, it gets bad when you cannot control that, when you have to have that stuff, when you start to depend on it that way. Are there potentially other practices that don't involve drugs or alcohol, like meditation, for example, or working out, that can help you de-stress as well, and might be like a little more healthy? I think, obviously, yes. And I think that's true of like psychedelics. I think, I don't want to be like a proponent of things like cocaine, but like there's all kinds of, there's reasons why people do drugs, and the problem is when it's not really, I think, with the experimentation or the use or some self-medication. It's when that self-medication becomes something that takes control, So.
I'm saying abusive.
Abusive, yeah. When it becomes an abusive relationship between the substance or it doesn't even have to be a substance too, right? It could be work, right? You can work to avoid dealing with things, which in some cases might be somewhat useful, but if it's to the point where you're never dealing with your issues, then maybe it's not so healthy. And so that social worker's theory on coping mechanisms, it will probably stick with me to the end of time. It seems like a great arbiter. Yeah. Anybody else? We don't have a mic anymore, so yeah.
This business about these different Corolla and the Subaru.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of that, like in a certain way, everybody wants a Ferrari because we've been trained to think that way.
Mm.
And it just strikes me as obviously seductive, and I use the word seductive advisedly. It's like, that's off the path. If that's what you're thinking is, you're off any kind of reasonable path for yourself. That makes no sense whatsoever, unless it really makes sense for you, which is different, which is a different thing. Like if you discover that this is really what makes you feel alive, then fine. But you know what I mean? There's just like this seductiveness about, because it has so much to do, you couldn't just tell that story at all times, because that's a product of our times,
Yeah.
But there's something about it. There's like, for me, it just like it puts up a red flag. I watch it, because that's a dangerous thing to look at things that way. Like meditating 5 times a day is clearly better than once. What? Who says?
I think sticking with the metaphor, right? So if you're the Mario Andretti of Buddhism or of meditation, then Ferrari probably is very appropriate. But most of us are not necessarily that way. I also like to compare. I always like to compare meditation to going to the gym for your mind. That's really like my thing, and which is ironic because I know Rochelle has mentioned in the past that Chogyam Trungpa hated working out and would be like horrified by the idea that we're calling it like going to the gym for your mind. But I don't know if you'd agree, but the thing that I also like to think of in that context, using a gym metaphor to just flesh out our metaphors tonight, is, so you have like foundational practices, basic meditation, shamatha, vipassana, and this stuff, which is kind of like doing cardio and like, or swimming, or like, going for a run, or like, I don't know. And then you have, and you can kind of go your whole life, I think, and just be in great shape and really stay healthy by doing that. When I think about some of the Vajrayana practices that I'm aware of, which I'm not aware of a lot, but I know a little bit about it. And I think of like bodybuilders who go to the gym, and there's always like that one or two, there's like that one machine that's in the gym, and you have no idea how it works, right? And it develops like some strange muscle on the side of your back, that you can't get any other way. And I feel like that can be some more specific practices, practices that are not necessarily the bread and butter of being in shape, but they are a legitimate form of exercise, and something that if you're really trying to be an Olympic athlete of meditation, then or farther down the path, then these are great things, I don't know. Would you agree? I'm curious what you think about that. Would you agree that that's a way to look at it? No.
It would take a while to get into this with the Vajrayana.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I think
Okay. Yeah. No. We're gonna have to talk about this after. We're gonna talk about it though. So, yeah. Anybody else? Any questions? Go ahead. Yeah.
Just want to share my my thinking. If I catch myself, somewhere else, dealing with a lot of bumps, in my head, I usually just try to look for the bump in the room. I just say, confine myself in the room and just pay attention to the room and try to find where the bump is. Usually I cannot find it because they're always someplace else. So that's like kind of bringing the present, to the room itself. And if I sense danger, I say, okay, where's the danger? I am here. I'm here. Where's the danger? So I couldn't find the danger in this room. So since I cannot find it in this room, then kind of I tell myself off it. So that's the way I deal with it.
You tell yourself often?
Off it. Off.
Oh.
it doesn't exist.
I think that's, yeah. So I think that's, I think that happens to all of us in one way, shape, or form, in the sense that sometimes it's really obvious, like sometimes it's really, blunt dangers. Like maybe you're worried about physical danger, right? You're walking down the street and like you're kind of coming up with ideas about problems that you could have walking down the street at night. Other times it's like really subtle stuff, right? Where we're just sitting and we're kind of just maybe just a little bit stressed about, I don't know, anxious to like eat something because you're hungry, right? So it's like a whole spectrum of perceived dangers that may not really be important to the moment.
But I think I think my problem is that usually it already gained the momentum before I catch it, and that's the point. I can't, when you get the momentum, I know I should go back here, but that momentum has a lot of strength to keep on going and going.
Yeah.
It's like a rolling, And so I have to learn. For me, I have to learn to catch it right in the beginning, and that's the hardest part.
I think that's sort of the practice that we're doing, right? Is we're learning to notice when we're getting dragged away by our thoughts, telling ourselves stories and making things up, really, and just letting it go and coming back. And I agree that there's a momentum to strong emotions that you can't necessarily deny. You can have all this practice and all this training, or and train all your life and still get caught up in strong emotions, be they negative, positive, whatever. And sometimes, sometimes it can be very hard. but the practice is always the same, right? Noticing that stuff, letting it go, and trying to come back to what the present, what's really there. And I think that also, there's an aspect of examining when you're able to not get caught up in those strong emotions. There's an aspect of examining those strong emotions, right? If you're not caught up in it, you can actually sit with it. You can coexist with it, right? It can be there. You can be experiencing that emotion, but you can make friends with it a little bit. You can like roll it around in your mind, like explore like where it comes from. Where does it stem from? And I find that it always stems from fear of suffering in some way or shape or form. It's just a lot of times we blame something that's not actually the root of where the stuff is coming from. Or exaggerated. Yeah.
I want to add to that. I think that's part of that is becoming comfortable with your own vulnerability, which is part of what we just did. Is we were vulnerable about something that was very deep inside of us. We're sharing with a complete stranger. We don't know if they're going to judge us, and it's really an act of courage to do that because we open up to connect, and we hope that the person doesn't judge us and put us down or but like you said, hold that space. So it's an act of courage to be comfortable with yourself, your vulnerability, and sharing your life story with others. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think it's an act of courage on the part of the listener too, to constantly, to be confident enough to let go of whatever ideas or thought that are trying to take them away, and just keep coming back to being open and listening to the person in front of them, but the other one's probably a little harder, the sharing part.
I think it can be both. You're trying not to think while you're listening. You're trying not to respond in your mind as you're listening to them. So really quiet that and just really listen. Like that's what I had to do with Rick. Really listen to the story and not think about what my response is or how I can relate, even though I know I can. I just let him speak to me.
Chogyam Trungpa, who this was wrote this book, also wrote something called Shambhala, Path of the Warrior, and this is dangerous because I kind of like want to be a warrior myself, like I want to be, but he's talking about spiritual, like we're kind of spiritual warriors, right? We're facing fear, we're facing insecurity, and the way we're doing that is by exposing ourselves and making ourselves vulnerable. It's not by like going and conquering things. It's actually by opening to things. And that's scary. Yeah. It was just what Pema uses that term, Pema children. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the talk. It was really nice.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome.
And second, maybe bouncing off of the Ferrari comment, that we all want a Ferrari. That's true. So in a way, we're the products of our parents that are products of their parents. In a way, we're part of a Western tradition, and the Western tradition is all about ego. So the stronger your ego is, we're taught this as babies. The stronger your ego is, the better you are as a person in many ways, And it's the same culture of like Julius Caesar, of Elvis. Like we all want to be performers, we want to be seen, we want to be applauded, and that's in a way like a similar thing to a Ferrari, like a shiny, beautifully crafted, powerful machine. That's can be a metaphor for many things. So in a way, my question is can we get out of this fishbowl that is our conditioning, cultural conditioning? So how can we how does that? How is it? When you said that the path, there's no goal really, but the goal is liberation, right? So I'm wondering if that's compatible with our software, our Western mind, it's just just a question what is the ego for the Buddhists?
Well, so I would disagree with you on. There's a couple. There's probably three things there that I would want to comment on. The first thing I would disagree slightly with you, which is that the ego. I think that in most spiritual practices, I'm very familiar with Christianity, and I'm somewhat familiar with Judaism, and I'm familiar with Buddhism. And I would say that certainly in the Christian tradition, there is a lot of there's a lot about actually kind of giving up your ego. I think a lot of times people would describe it as kind of letting go of yourself, letting go of your ego, and giving it to God, like putting things in God's hands. So, and I think that there is in a lot of spiritual traditions, there is some aspect of trying to work with the same thing, really, right? Letting go of our own desires and being more open to what the universe or God has for us. So I do think that there is that aspect is not solely limited to that to Buddhism or to the Eastern mindset, as I understand it. The other thing I would say, though, but you've definitely identified an important issue, but I would also caution you in the sense that somewhere it seems like the Ferrari has become a negative thing, and the Ferrari is not a negative thing. It's actually this amazing car that would be pretty cool to drive if you could. So I don't want us to focus on the Ferrari as being a negative thing because it's catering to our materialism, right? It's a vehicle that goes very fast and is very responsive and brakes really well and all these things. But to your point, I think that the Vajrayana's practices obviously go along with that too, right? They're not. I'm not trying to cast them in any kind of negative light. Just that they're not as useful in certain hands, right? If you haven't been taught how to drive the Ferrari, then it can be a problem. But as far as just talking about dealing with the ego and our programming, I think that that's a human thing. I think that the egos exist all across the world. It's a basic part of us as humans, and there are definitely cultural differences, but it's all the same, regardless of how they manifest culturally, and the cultural conditioning. It still ultimately comes down to our individual experience of ego, and our individual experience and ideas about what we think we want, how we want things to be, and how we think they should be, and then learning to recognize that that's our ego talking, and sort of letting go of it, and coming back to what is right in front of us, and what is we're dealing with in the present. And I think that any mind, I think, can be deprogrammed that way. And we also talk about ego. We think of ego as purely negative in a lot of times. I think sometimes it's presented as, we're always presenting it as negative, and certainly in Buddhist talks. I think, but the thing is, from an evolutionary standpoint, the ego is very helpful. It really helped us achieve a lot of stuff, right? It drives people to achieve things, which, you could make an argument as to whether or not we're good for the world, because we seem to be destroying it in the process of sort of, winning out as a species in the world. But the ego is, it's not that it's wholly negative or wholly positive, or it's some combination of those things, but it's more like it just is. And it's without the ego, we wouldn't have anything to work with. So in a funny kind of way, it's we need the development of the ego in order to learn how to be free from it. And an interesting thing about the Tibetans that I understand is that they don't teach their kids to meditate until they're at least 8 or 9, something like that, because they feel they need to actually fully form their egos before they can start working with them. And I think that's kind of, it's interesting. I've read that. I don't know if there are any Tibetan experts in here, the Tibetan Buddhist experts that can verify that that is the case? John? I've heard of this as well. Have you heard of this?
You heard it from me.
Was it from you? Okay, so there you go. All right.
And I heard it from Rinpoche.
Okay, so
The thing is that, I mean, I once said something to him similar to what you're saying.
Hmm.
You know, I said, don't you sort of need ego to function in the world? You know, it's sort of provisionally.
Hmm.
And he leaned forward in his chair and he bellowed at me. Ego is a lie, like that.
Hmm.
So I mean, you know, it's what ego is a mistake. You know, they call it error, and the error is that I exist, and if I exist and you exist, and we have this polar relationship. And what the Vajrayana really is about is just a more powerful way of dissolving that error. And in the course of dissolving the error, you know, when we're caught in it, when we see the world as I and other, we're constantly walking around and judging everything. We're saying this is good, that's bad, and we see the world through this veil of judgment, and it colors the way we see the world. We don't see the true world. We see it in terms of our idiosyncratic, very personal judgments that we learned from, you know, a lot of it from our parents over the course of the years. Mine are different than yours, and they're very, you know, and they're distortions. And the idea is that what we're doing on the path is we're dissolving that, beginning to see the world stripped of these errors. The error being, you know, that I'm a separate person, you're a separate person. We have this relationship. Do I like you? Do I not like you? You know, do you like me? And all that, and dissolving that, beginning to see the world as it truly is. So, two things are happening on the path. One is that we're getting free of unhappiness and suffering and error, you know, on our side. And on the other side, the world is beginning to change because we see it differently. And, you know, it's a different world when you strip away all that stuff. And so, you know, there's a slogan around it. Was it you who used it? You know, change your mind, change the world. Somebody's using that right now. And what happens is that in the Vajrayana, they're trying to conjure up the enlightened world very powerfully and suggest it to us, because then if they can do it, it'll draw us out of our confusion. You know, if you can begin to see things as enlightened, in order to, you know, in an enlightened way, you have to give up your confusion in order to do that. People aren't ready for that at the beginning stages of the path. They're really just working on beginning to understand how confused they are, and then beginning to get glimmers of what the world might be like in an unconfused view. So it takes some preparation to get to the Vajrayana. And then at the Vajrayana, these views, you see, they're put, the language is very, I mean, it's like that, you know? It's very colorful, it's wild, it's full of symbol. They say that there are 3 levels of teachings. These are called the 3 lineages, and the first level is mind to mind. And that's very, very advanced. And the second level is the symbolic level of teaching. And the third level is word. And at the beginning, people have to hear the words. They need words, you know. And then at a sort of advanced level, they begin to respond to symbol, be drawn into enlightened world through the use of symbols. And that's just one example of symbol, but there's a lot more, you know. And the Vajrayana is really all about symbol. And then even beyond the Vajrayana, sort of the outer limits of the Vajrayana, you get what they call mind-to-mind transmission. And that is, you know, that has to do with the openness that you guys were talking about. That only takes place in complete vulnerability, complete openness, that kind of mind transmission, mind teaching can happen.
Yeah.
And I drove a Ferrari once. A friend of mine showed up one time. This was about 10, 12 years ago. I was living out in the country, and my friend Pedro shows up, and he was a day early. He said he wanted to come to practice. I said, "Why did you come up early?" And he said, "Oh," he said, "I got something to show you. Come out." And I went out in the driveway, and there's this bright red car. It was gorgeous, an F430. And it was amazing. And I said, my voice really envy. "Oh, Pedro, did you just buy this? And he said, "No, I rented it. It's for your birthday. Pack a bag. We're leaving." And I went in and threw my clothes into a bag, and we got into this Ferrari. We drove it for a day, and I had paddle shifters. Just like
Yeah.
It takes a while to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And fast. Oh my God! And it was outrageous. I've never been in a car that fast. It's insane. The thing does 195 miles an hour. We got stopped twice. So I got stopped.
There's no road like that in the United States.
We had it up on some back roads up in Vermont to about 130, 135.
I think in Europe they have, especially Germany, they have the road that.
Oh, yeah, the Autobahn.
Yeah,
Autobahn,
but
yeah.
now but in the
Yeah,
States you
this
just
time.
don't have it. Yeah.
And I learned something about Ferraris. They're not like Mercedes. They are not a comfortable
No.
ride. They are a sports car.
Yeah,
And
they
you can, I mean, when Pedro, if I was sitting next to Pedro and he stepped down on the accelerator, he couldn't hear me talk. I could shout, he wouldn't be able to hear me. So the engine noise is so loud inside that thing. And it rattles. It rattled. I couldn't believe it. This is a $250,000 car. And I can hear the screws rattling in the molding on the windshield. It was a beautiful thing, And it's utterly Spartan. Utterly Spartan. But when you stop and people come up and look at it, it looks like it's just been squeezed out of another dimension. And that's where it's like the Vajrayana. Vajrayana is all about learning to see this world as really extraordinary and beautiful and new and fresh and rising in this present moment and full of meaning. We don't see the meaning. That's the magic in the Vajrayana. They say that if you have the eyes to see, this is a Vajrayana slogan, this world is a heavenly palace full of gods and goddesses. But we don't see it that way. We see it as this veil of tears. Jesus Christ.
So,
We have to go.
yeah, no, it's okay. No, actually, I'm just gonna say the dedication, sort of. So we are out of time, guys. Thank you for coming. These things are always a group effort, so it's really nice to have your participation.